At my daughter's wedding, her fiancé humiliated me with a cake. I smiled and waited until morning. It was like that fateful day in 1929 when the stock market crashed, wiping out fortunes overnight and revealing who truly held the reins of power, but I kept my composure, knowing my own reversal was coming. I remember the rehearsal dinner at that trendy rooftop steakhouse in Austin, where the air was thick with the scent of grilled steaks and smug superiority. My daughter Emma's fiancé, Clay Barlow, sat there with his parents, Brad and Cara, all polished and performative in their designer outfits. They eyed my thrift store blazer, the one I'd worn for years out of habit, not necessity, and the vintage locket I'd given Emma as a family heirloom. Clay let out a chuckle, loud enough for the table to hear, mocking how quaint it was, like something from a garage sale. His parents joined in, with Cara adding that it was endearingly retro, her tone dripping with pity. Then, as if it were some grand gesture, Clay announced he'd charitably cover the entire tab, making a show of pulling out his platinum card while glancing at me with that condescending smile. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I stayed silent, wiping my mouth with a napkin. Later that night, I pulled Emma aside and asked her to keep my finances private, no hints about my situation. I wanted their true colors to emerge on their own, without any prompting from me. It was a test, one that would reveal more than any words could. After that rehearsal dinner, the weeks leading up to the wedding felt like a slow unraveling of a poorly knit sweater. I kept my head down, maintaining the facade of the modest, unassuming father from Round Rock, Texas, driving my old Chevy pickup and living in that simple house that hadn't seen a renovation since Emma was in pigtails. But behind the scenes, I embarked on what I called my quiet audit, a month of silent observation and meticulous digging, drawing on my years as a forensic accountant before I stepped away from the corporate grind. It started subtly, with little slights that piled up like unnoticed entries in a ledger. First, I noticed my face had been cropped out of the venue's online gallery photos from the engagement party. It was as if I'd been erased, reduced to a ghost in my own daughter's milestone. Then, at a planning meeting, my assigned seat at the ceremony was quietly shifted from the front row to row 9, tucked behind a cluster of distant relatives and plus ones. Brad Barlow, Clay's father, pulled me aside with that oily charm of his, explaining it was for optics. Apparently, having the poor dad up front didn't fit their polished image. He said it with a pat on my shoulder, like he was doing me a favor, but I saw the calculation in his eyes. I didn't argue. Instead, I smiled politely and nodded, filing it away. As a former forensic accountant, I'd spent decades spotting discrepancies in financial statements, uncovering hidden debts and inflated assets. People like the Barlows were no different, flashy on the surface but often rotten underneath. So, I started my audit in earnest. Late at night, after Emma had gone to bed or was out with Clay, I'd sit at my old oak desk in the study, the one with the creaky drawer full of yellowed receipts, and dive into the digital trails they left behind. Clay's credit cards were the first red flag. A quick search through public records and some discreet cross-referencing showed they were maxed out to the hilt, over $150,000 in revolving debt, with payments barely scraping the minimums. He'd been living large, posting photos of luxury watches and weekend getaways on social media, but the math didn't add up. His LLC, some vague consulting firm called Barlow Strategies, was even shakier. Incorporated just 2 years ago, it had no real revenue streams, just a trail of bounced checks and unpaid vendor invoices. I archived screenshots of everything, time-stamped and organized in folders on my encrypted drive. But it was the social media posts that really stung, and they confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Clay and his family were clout chasers, the kind who built their egos on tearing others down. I found a series of subtle smears, anonymous comments on wedding forums and Reddit threads, painting me as the poor dad who couldn't afford to contribute to the wedding, implying I was a deadbeat or a burden. One post even joked about how Emma was upgrading by marrying into the Barlows. I traced the IP addresses back. They led straight to locations tied to the family: Café Azure, Cara's favorite spot in downtown Austin, where she'd post her latte art photos. The timestamps matched her check-ins perfectly. It was sloppy work, the kind of amateur hour that would make any seasoned auditor chuckle. I didn't confront them. No, I archived it all in silence, letting the evidence build like compound interest. Each discovery was a quiet victory, a reminder that true power isn't in flaunting wealth but in knowing when to reveal it. I'd learned that lesson long ago, back when Emma was just a toddler and I was scraping by after her mother passed. Those were hard years, but they taught me resilience, the kind the Barlows clearly lacked. As the wedding date approached, I reflected on my own path, the hidden ledger that defined my chosen life. It all started 2 decades ago, when I was at my lowest. I'd lost my job in a corporate downsizing, and with $8,200 left in savings, every penny I'd managed to squirrel away, I took a gamble. A buddy from my accounting days tipped me off to a scrappy cloud computing startup in Houston, back when the cloud was just a buzzword. I invested it all, not out of recklessness, but because I'd crunched the numbers and seen the potential. 16 months later, that startup exited for $4.9 million in a buyout by a tech giant. My share? Enough to change everything. But I didn't blow it on mansions or sports cars. No, I reinvested slowly, methodically, into broad market indexes that compounded over the years, industrial parks in growing suburbs that generated steady rental income, and solar bonds that aligned with my quiet belief in sustainable futures. It grew, quietly, into several $100 million, all tucked away behind trusts and LLCs that kept my name off the radar. I chose the modest house in Round Rock, the old Chevy that still ran like a dream, because I wanted Emma to learn dignity before display. Flashy wealth breeds entitlement, I'd seen it destroy families in my auditing days. Emma grew up thinking we were comfortable but careful, volunteering at food banks and earning her own way through college. That was my gift to her, a foundation of character, not cash. The slights continued as the big day loomed. Invitations to family brunches went unanswered, and when I offered to help with logistics, Brad dismissed it with a wave, saying they had professionals handling everything. I let it slide, focusing instead on my preparations. By the time we arrived at the wedding venue in San Antonio's Botanical Gardens, the air was alive with the scent of blooming jasmine and the murmur of well-heeled guests. The gardens were stunning, manicured lawns, arching palm trees, and a gazebo draped in white roses, but I was treated like an afterthought. Ushers steered me away from the pre-ceremony photos, claiming the immediate family shots were first. I stood on the periphery, watching Clay pose with Emma, his arm possessively around her waist, while Brad and Cara beamed like they'd orchestrated the perfect union. Even the champagne trays seemed to ghost me, servers glided past without offering a glass, as if I were invisible. Dinner was a lavish affair under string lights, with courses of seared scallops and filet mignon. But during dessert, Clay decided to make his move. He stood up, glass in hand, and launched into what he called a light-hearted toast. The room chuckled at first, but then he zeroed in on me. "And to Emma's dad," he said, grinning like a shark, "who's been such a sport about everything. I know you've got that diabetes thing, so I saved you the best part, no sugar for you." With that, he grabbed a slice of the towering wedding cake, its top-tier buttercream glistening, and smeared it across my face. The cold frosting hit my cheek, dripping down my chin, and the room erupted in awkward laughter. Some guests looked away. Uncomfortable, but Clay basked in it, high-fiving a groomsman. Humiliation burned in my gut, but I remembered my line, the one I'd rehearsed in my mind since the rehearsal dinner. At my daughter's wedding, her fiancé humiliated me with a cake. I smiled and waited until morning. So, I did just that. I smiled, calm as ever, pulled out my handkerchief, and wiped my face clean. Then, I turned to the tech guy handling the sound system and asked him to turn the lights up. The room quieted, sensing something was shifting. Before I could speak, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. Marion Boyd, a powerhouse in her own right, a Dallas-based founder of a massive warehouse fund and a trustee of the Botanical Gardens, stood up from her table near the back. I'd crossed paths with her years ago through investment circles, but she recognized me instantly. "If I may," she said, her voice steady and authoritative, "I'd like to introduce Emma's father properly. He's not just any guest, he's an early investor in 2 tech companies that went public, turning modest stakes into fortunes, and a silent partner in several industrial REITs that have reshaped Texas real estate." The room pivoted, smirks turned to stiff spines, whispers rippling like a wave. Brad and Kara jumped in, faces pale, stammering about misunderstandings and offering fresh starts and strategic synergies. It was pathetic, their sudden pivot from disdain to desperation. I wasn't done. Unfolding the printouts from my jacket pocket, not glossy profiles, but hard evidence, I laid it out. A term sheet showing Clay's stake in a joint venture was due for covenant breaches, meaning his empire was crumbling. Timestamps tied the smear posts directly to Kara's cafe Wi-Fi, irrefutable proof of their pettiness. And I mentioned the packet I'd file at 8 a.m., detailing bartered venue perks, sales tax skimming, and fake status gifts that screamed fraud. The room fell silent. Then, Emma's palm cracked across Clay's cheek, the slap echoing like the first crack in their perfect narrative. She stood there, eyes blazing, realizing the truth. I refused to be family by calculation. Rising, I headed for the doors, the weight of the evening lifting with each step. Emma tore off her veil, announced to the stunned crowd there'd be no wedding, and followed me. We climbed into my old pickup and drove north under a pink Texas dawn. In the morning, smiling, I answered Marion's email about co-founding a teacher housing fund in Hill Country, on one condition: the first classroom bear my mother's name, the woman who taught me that dignity decides whether anyone deserves the money they have. As we drove north in my old Chevy pickup under that pink Texas dawn, the weight of the previous night began to lift like fog burning off the Hill Country hills. Emma sat beside me, her wedding dress bunched up around her knees, the veil discarded in the back seat like a forgotten prop from a bad play. She hadn't said much since we left the botanical gardens, just stared out the window at the passing mesquite trees and cattle ranches, her face a mix of shock and relief. I kept my eyes on the road, giving her space, but inside, my mind was already turning to the future, the real one, not the scripted farce the Barlows had tried to impose. "Dad," she finally whispered, her voice cracking, "how long have you known about Clay, about everything?" I glanced at her, seeing the little girl I'd raised reflected in her eyes, the one who'd learned to tie her shoes on her own because I believed in self-reliance. "Long enough, sweetheart," I replied softly. "But I needed you to see it for yourself. That's the only way lessons stick." We stopped at a roadside diner just outside Fredericksburg, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that could strip paint off a barn. Emma ordered pancakes, pushing them around her plate more than eating, while I sipped black coffee and watched the sun climb higher. She told me everything then, the doubts she'd ignored, the way Clay's charm had masked his insecurities, how his parents had pressured her into overlooking the red flags for the sake of appearances. It broke my heart to hear it, but it also mended something deeper, confirming that my choice to live modestly had instilled in her the values I'd hoped for. As we talked, my phone buzzed with Marion Boyd's email, the one about co-founding that teacher housing fund. I read it aloud to Emma, and her eyes lit up for the first time that morning. "Mom would have loved that," she said, referring to her grandmother, my mother, who'd been a schoolteacher in a one-room schoolhouse back in the day. I nodded, typing my response, "Yes," on the condition that the first classroom bears her name, Eleanor Hayes, the woman who taught me that dignity decides whether anyone deserves the money they have. It felt like a fitting capstone to the chaos, a way to turn humiliation into something enduring. By midday, we reached my house in Round Rock, the modest ranch-style home with the wraparound porch and the garden I'd tended myself. Emma wandered inside, kicking off her heels, and collapsed on the couch where she'd spent countless evenings doing homework. I made us sandwiches, simple turkey on rye, nothing fancy, and we ate in companionable silence. That's when the calls started flooding in. First, it was Brad Barlow, his voice a mix of bluster and desperation, apologizing for the miscommunications and suggesting we reconvene to salvage the wedding. I let it go to voicemail, archiving it like the rest of their nonsense. Kara followed, tearful and pleading, claiming it was all a big misunderstanding fueled by wedding stress. Clay himself left a rambling message, promising to make things right and hinting at some vague business opportunity he thought might entice me. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I forwarded the packet I'd mentioned the night before to the appropriate authorities, a digital dossier on their tax skimming, the bartered perks that skirted regulations, and the fake status gifts that screamed money laundering. By 8 a.m., as promised, it was filed, and I knew the fallout would hit them like a Texas thunderstorm. Emma spent the afternoon unpacking her things from the boxes she'd half-packed for her new life with Clay. We talked about what came next for her, maybe going back to her graphic design job in Austin, or pursuing that art therapy certification she'd always dreamed of. I shared more about my own hidden world, the investments I'd nurtured over the years. She was stunned at first, poring over the statements I showed her, but then she hugged me fiercely. "You could have told me," she said. "I would have understood." I shook my head. "It wasn't about hiding, Emma. It was about teaching. Wealth without wisdom is just a trap." That evening, as the sun set, we sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the yard. For the first time in months, I felt at peace, knowing we'd dodged a bullet disguised as a fairy tale. The next few days blurred into a rhythm of recovery and revelation. News of the cancelled wedding spread like wildfire through our social circles, amplified by the Barlow's own clout-chasing habits. Whispers turned to headlines when the authorities launched an investigation into Barlow Strategies LLC. Turns out my audit had uncovered more than I'd even realized, including ties to shady offshore accounts that Clay had used to prop up his lifestyle. Reporters called, but I declined interviews. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. Emma, meanwhile, fielded messages from friends who'd been at the wedding, many apologizing for not speaking up sooner. One bridesmaid even confessed she'd seen Clay's true nature but stayed silent out of loyalty. It was a hard lesson for everyone, but Emma handled it with grace, focusing on rebuilding rather than bitterness. I turned my attention to the teacher housing fund with Marion. We scheduled a meeting in Dallas, where she outlined the vision: affordable homes for educators in underserved hill country districts, complete with community centers and classrooms named after unsung heroes like my mother. I committed a significant chunk of my portfolio, enough to get it off the ground without fanfare, and insisted on anonymity for my involvement. "Let the work speak for itself," I told her. Emma joined us virtually, offering design ideas for the buildings. Her creativity sparking in ways I hadn't seen since she was a kid sketching in notebooks. It felt like a new chapter, one where our family's legacy shifted from quiet endurance to active good. As weeks turned to months, Emma and I grew closer than ever. We took road trips in the old Chevy, exploring Texas backroads, visiting solar farms I'd invested in, and even volunteering at local schools. She started dating again, cautiously, this time with a guy from her art class, a quiet teacher who valued substance over show. I watched her bloom, free from the Barlow's shadow. And me? I kept my life simple, but with a few upgrades, a new coat of paint on the house, perhaps, and plans for a small foundation in my mother's name. The humiliation of that cake-smearing moment faded, replaced by the satisfaction of having waited, smiled, and won on my terms. Dignity, after all, isn't given, it's earned, and it's the greatest fortune of all. As the months rolled on after that fateful wedding day, life in Round Rock settled into a comfortable groove, but the ripples from the Barlow debacle continued to spread far beyond our quiet porch. Emma threw herself into her art therapy certification program, attending classes in Austin and even starting a small online community for aspiring designers dealing with life's curveballs. I'd watch her from the kitchen window, sketching under the old oak tree in the backyard, her laughter returning in bursts as she video-called friends who'd stuck by her. For me, the teacher housing fund with Marion Boyd became more than just a project. It evolved into a passion, a way to channel the energy from that humiliating night into something tangible and good. We broke ground on the first site in Kerrville, a sprawling complex with modest bungalows and a central community hall. I attended the ceremony incognito, blending in with the crowd of local educators and officials, but when they unveiled the plaque for the Eleanor Hayes classroom, I felt a swell of pride that no amount of money could buy. Emma was there too, her hand in mine, whispering, "This is what real legacy looks like, Dad." The Barlows, however, weren't fading quietly into the background. News of the investigation I'd sparked hit the local papers, then escalated to state headlines when auditors uncovered a web of financial improprieties that went deeper than I'd imagined. Clay's LLC wasn't just shaky, it was a house of cards built on embezzled funds from family trusts and falsified expense reports. Brad, ever the opportunist, tried to distance himself, but emails surfaced linking him to the schemes. Turns out he'd been using company perks to fund their lavish lifestyle, including that charitable rehearsal dinner tab. Kara, the social butterfly, saw her carefully curated Instagram empire crumble as sponsors pulled out, citing the scandal. I didn't gloat, that wasn't my style. But when a process server showed up at my door with a subpoena for my evidence packet, I cooperated fully, spending a crisp autumn morning in a deposition room, laying out the facts like entries in a balanced ledger. The prosecutor nodded appreciatively, calling my audit meticulous, and I left feeling like I'd closed a chapter, not started a vendetta. Emma handled the fallout with a maturity that made me prouder than any investment return. She got a few nasty messages from Clay's circle, accusing her of betrayal, but she blocked them and focused on healing. One evening, as we grilled burgers in the backyard, the simple kind, with store-brand buns and no frills, she opened up about the emotional toll. "I feel stupid for not seeing it sooner," she admitted, poking at the coals. I set down my spatula and sat beside her. "We all miss signs when we're in love, Emma. The important thing is you saw them in time." That conversation led to her starting a blog, anonymous at first, sharing stories of toxic relationships disguised as fairy tales. It gained traction quickly, especially among young women in Texas, and soon she was fielding requests for advice columns. I helped her set up a basic website, drawing on my tech investment knowledge, and watched as her voice became a beacon for others. It was ironic, really, the Barlows' attempt to humiliate us had inadvertently launched her into a new career path. Meanwhile, my own world expanded in unexpected ways. Marion introduced me to a network of philanthropists, low-key types like myself who preferred impact over accolades. We met in unassuming coffee shops in Dallas, discussing ventures beyond the housing fund, things like renewable energy grants for rural schools and microloans for teacher startups. I committed to a few, always anonymously, but one project stood out, a scholarship program for kids from modest backgrounds, much like the one I'd grown up in. Named after my mother Sutley, it aimed to teach financial literacy alongside academics, ensuring the next generation understood that wealth is a tool, not a personality trait. Emma got involved too, designing the program's logo and materials, her graphic skills shining through. It felt like we were building a family empire of a different sort, one rooted in values rather than vanity. Of course, not everything was smooth. Clay made one last desperate play, showing up unannounced at my house one rainy afternoon, his designer clothes rumpled and his eyes bloodshot. He begged for a meeting, claiming he wanted to apologize properly, and hinting at some restitution. I let him in, more out of curiosity than compassion, and we sat in the living room where Emma used to play with her dolls. He rambled about how the pressure from his parents had driven him to it, how he'd never meant to hurt anyone. "I can pay you back, whatever it takes," he said, pulling out a crumpled checkbook. I listened, then shook my head. "This isn't about money, Clay. It's about character. You humiliated me in front of everyone, but more importantly, you disrespected Emma." He left deflated, and that was the last we heard from him directly. Rumors swirled that he'd fled to California, chasing some get-rich-quick scheme in Silicon Valley, but I didn't bother verifying. The legal system would handle the rest. As winter approached, Emma and I took a trip to the hill country to check on the housing fund's progress. The drive in the old Chevy was nostalgic, filled with her playlists of indie folk songs and stops at roadside stands for pecan pie. At the site, workers were framing the first homes, and Marion greeted us with hard hats and blueprints. "This is going to change lives," she said, and I believed her. Emma wandered the grounds, envisioning gardens and play areas, her enthusiasm infectious. On the way back, she turned to me. "Dad, what if we did more? Like, expand this nationally?" It sparked an idea, and by the time we got home, we were brainstorming a foundation to scale the model. I crunched the numbers that night, my forensic accounting skills coming in handy once more, projecting costs and impacts. It was exhilarating, a far cry from the quiet audits of my past. Spring brought new beginnings. Emma's blog evolved into a podcast, and she even landed a guest spot on a local radio show discussing resilience after betrayal. I listened from my study, smiling at her poise. My investments continued to thrive, the solar bonds paid dividends, and a new index fund I'd seeded hit record highs. But the real wealth was in the everyday moments, Sunday dinners where we'd laugh about the wedding fiasco, turning it into family lore rather than a wound. One day, Marion called with news: the first teachers had moved into the housing complex, and the Eleanor Hayes classroom was hosting its inaugural workshop. Emma and I drove down for the open house, mingling with grateful families. A young teacher approached me, thanking me without knowing my full role. "This means I can afford to stay and teach here," she said. It echoed my mother's ethos, and I knew we'd done right. Looking back, that cake-smearing humiliation was a catalyst, not a defeat. It stripped away illusions and built something stronger. Emma found her path, I found purpose in giving back, and together, we proved that dignity triumphs over display. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the Texas stars emerge, I felt content. The morning after the wedding had indeed been a win, but the true victory was in the life we'd crafted since that summer heat gave way to the crisp breezes of another Texas fall. Our lives in Round Rock took on a rhythm that felt both familiar and refreshingly new. Emma's podcast had exploded in popularity, drawing listeners from across the state and beyond, with episodes delving into themes of self-worth and spotting red flags in relationships. She'd even been invited to speak at a women's empowerment conference in Houston, her story of walking away from the altar resonating like a modern parable. I drove her there in the old Chevy, the same truck that had carried us away from the wedding chaos, and sat in the audience beaming as she took the stage. "My dad taught me that true strength isn't in what you show the world," she said, glancing my way, "but in what you build quietly, with integrity." The applause was thunderous, and afterward, over greasy diner burgers on the drive home, she confided, "I couldn't have done this without you, Dad." That night, it was the push I needed. I squeezed her hand, knowing the humiliation I'd endured had forged her resilience, turning a personal low into a public triumph. The Teacher Housing Fund continued to flourish under Marion's leadership and my behind-the-scenes support. We'd expanded to a second site in Bandera, focusing on eco-friendly designs with solar panels, tying into my investments in renewable bonds. I visited often, not as a big-shot donor but as a volunteer, helping plant community gardens or mentoring young teachers on basic financial planning. One afternoon, while tilling soil alongside a group of educators, a principal pulled me aside. "You're the guy behind the Eleanor Hayes name, aren't you?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. I nodded modestly, and he shared how the affordable housing had kept his best staff from relocating to bigger cities. It was moments like these that validated my hidden ledger life, quiet impacts that rippled outward, far more satisfying than any flashy display the Barlows had chased. Speaking of the Barlows, their downfall played out like a slow-motion train wreck in the media. Clay's trial made headlines, with charges of fraud and embezzlement sticking like burrs on a wool sock. He took a plea deal, avoiding jail but facing hefty fines and community service, ironic, given how he'd mocked my modest ways. Brad lost his executive position at a Austin firm, the scandal tainting his reputation, while Kara retreated from social media, her once glamorous feeds now silent. I received a formal letter from their lawyer, offering a settlement to resolve any lingering disputes, but I declined. It wasn't about money, it was about accountability. Emma read the letter over my shoulder and rolled her eyes. "They're still trying to buy their way out," she said. We burned it in the backyard fire pit that night, toasting marshmallows instead and laughing about how far we'd come. Emma's new relationship with Alex, the teacher from her art class, blossomed steadily. He was the antithesis of Clay, grounded, kind, with a passion for history that matched her creative spirit. They met for coffee dates that turned into hikes in the hill country, and I met him formally over a home-cooked meal of chili and cornbread. "Sir," he said nervously, shaking my hand, "I admire what you've built here. Emma's told me about your philosophy on life." We talked for hours, and I saw in him the dignity I'd always hoped for her. No grand gestures, just genuine respect. Emma confided later that she was taking it slow, applying the lessons from her past. "No more rushing into fairy tales," she said. It warmed my heart to see her happy, truly happy, without the veneer of pretense. My own days filled with purpose. I dove deeper into philanthropy, partnering with Marion on a literacy initiative tied to the housing fund, providing books and tutoring for teachers' kids. We hosted a fundraiser in Dallas, low-key but effective, raising enough to stock libraries in 3 districts. I spoke briefly at the event, sharing my mother's story, how she'd taught in rural schools with nothing but chalk and determination, instilling in me the value of education over excess. Attendees approached me afterward, sharing their own tales of quiet perseverance, and it struck me how universal that struggle was. Back home, I updated my investment portfolio, shifting more into sustainable ventures like wind farms in West Texas. The returns were solid, but the real payoff was knowing it supported jobs and clean energy, aligning with the legacy I was building. One crisp morning, an unexpected email arrived from a journalist researching family dynamics in wealth disparities. She wanted to interview me about the wedding incident, framing it as a rags to riches revenge story. I politely declined, but it got me thinking. Maybe it was time to share a bit more, not for glory, but to inspire. Emma encouraged it, so I agreed to an anonymous op-ed in a local paper, titled "The Cake and the Comeuppance." In it, I detailed the humiliation without naming names, focusing on the lessons, how dignity trumps display, and how waiting for the right moment can turn tables. The piece went viral in Texas circles, sparking discussions on social media. Strangers reached out, sharing similar stories of being underestimated, and it felt like an extension of Emma's podcast, a collective healing. As winter holidays approached, we decorated the house modestly, a real tree from a local farm, lights strung on the porch. Alex joined us for Christmas dinner, and we exchanged simple gifts, a sketchbook for Emma, a history book for him, and for me, a framed photo of the Eleanor Hayes classroom. It was a far cry from the ostentatious celebrations the Barlows might have thrown, but infinitely warmer. New Year's Eve found us on the porch, watching fireworks from afar. Emma raised a glass of sparkling cider. "To new beginnings," she toasted. I clinked my glass, reflecting on the year, from that smeared cake to this moment of peace. Spring brought expansions. The foundation grew, with Emma taking a board seat, her ideas infusing fresh energy. We launched a mentorship program, pairing seasoned investors like me with young entrepreneurs from underserved communities. I mentored a kid from San Antonio, teaching him the basics of compounding interest over coffee meetings. It reminded me of my own start, that $8,200 gamble that snowballed into fortune. Emma's relationship with Alex deepened, they talked of moving in together, and I gave my blessing, knowing she'd chosen wisely. By summer, the Barlow saga closed with Clay's community service assignment, ironically, at a nonprofit aiding financial literacy, the very thing he'd lacked. I heard through the grapevine he'd reformed somewhat, but I didn't dwell. Instead, I focused on a family trip to the coast, where Emma, Alex, and I walked beaches and built sandcastles, laughing freely. Life had come full circle, proving that from humiliation can spring the sweetest victories. As I watched the waves, I knew my mother's lessons had endured. Dignity isn't just about what you have, but how you use it to lift others. As the golden hues of another Texas autumn painted the leaves in Round Rock, our family's story continued to unfold in ways that felt both inevitable and profoundly rewarding. Emma's podcast had grown into a full-fledged media venture, with sponsorships from wellness brands and invitations to collaborate with influencers in the self-help space. She recorded episodes from a makeshift studio in the spare bedroom, her voice confident and compelling as she dissected the psychology of toxic dynamics, often drawing from our shared experience without revealing too many personal details. I listened to every one, sometimes offering quiet feedback over breakfast, simple suggestions like tightening a narrative arc or adding a historical anecdote to illustrate resilience. One episode, titled "The Illusion of Perfection," went viral, amassing over 1 million downloads. In it, she spoke of the wedding cake incident metaphorically, calling it a smeared facade that revealed deeper cracks. Listeners flooded her inbox with their own stories, and she confided in me one evening, "Dad, this is therapy for me too. It's like turning our pain into a lifeline for others." Alex, her steady partner, became a fixture in our lives, helping with everything from yard work to brainstorming episode ideas. He proposed to her on a quiet hike in Enchanted Rock State Park. Nothing extravagant, just a simple ring he'd saved for, presented with a handwritten note about building a future on solid ground. Emma said yes, tears in her eyes, and they shared the news over a family dinner that night. I raised a glass of iced tea, my heart full. "To love that's earned, not performed," I toasted. Unlike the Barlow spectacle, their wedding planning was understated, a small ceremony in our backyard, with close friends and no pretensions. I offered to help financially, but they insisted on covering most of it themselves, a testament to the values I'd instilled. As the date approached, I reflected on how far we'd come, from that humiliating smear of buttercream to this moment of genuine joy. It was as if the universe had balanced the scales, rewarding patience with authenticity. The philanthropy work ramped up, pulling me into new territories. Marion and I launched a national arm of the Teacher Housing Fund, partnering with organizations in other states to replicate the model. We held virtual meetings with stakeholders from California to New York, discussing scalable designs that incorporated green tech from my solar investments. I committed another tranche of funds, drawing from the industrial REITs that had appreciated steadily. One project in particular excited me, a pilot in rural Appalachia, where abandoned warehouses, echoing my own investment roots, were converted into affordable teacher communities. During a site visit, I walked the grounds with local officials, sharing stories of my mother's one-room schoolhouse days. "Education isn't just about books," I told them. "It's about giving teachers the stability to inspire." They named a wing after Eleanor Hayes, and I sent photos to Emma, who beamed with pride. Back home, she incorporated the story into her podcast, weaving it into an episode on generational legacies. Challenges arose, as they always do. A minor scandal hit the fund when a contractor was accused of cutting corners on materials. Headlines speculated about oversight, and for a moment, it dredged up memories of the Barlow fraud. I dove in with my forensic accounting skills, auditing the books myself and uncovering that it was an isolated incident, not systemic. We fired the contractor, issued a transparent report, and moved forward stronger. The experience reminded me of my early investment days, when that Houston startup nearly folded before the buyout. Perseverance, I'd learned, was the real compound interest. Emma supported me through it, reminding me of my own advice: smile and wait until morning. Her words echoed my mantra, a full-circle affirmation that she'd internalized the lesson. Alex's family integrated seamlessly, a warm contrast to the Barlow chill. His parents, retired schoolteachers themselves, visited from Dallas, bringing homemade pies and stories of their modest life. We bonded over shared values, and I even advised them on optimizing their retirement portfolio, drawing from my index fund strategies. It felt good to share knowledge without fanfare, watching their eyes light up at the possibilities. Emma and Alex's wedding day arrived under a clear blue sky, the backyard transformed with wildflowers from the hill country and string lights we'd hung together. I walked her down the aisle, a simple path of scattered petals, my thrift store blazer pressed and proud. No optics, no performances, just love. In my toast, I kept it brief, to dignity in all things, and to waiting for the dawn. The small crowd cheered, and as they exchanged vows, I felt a profound sense of closure, the cake incident now a distant, almost comical footnote. Post-wedding, life accelerated. Emma and Alex honeymooned in a cabin we rented in the mountains, returning with plans to start a family someday. She expanded her platform into a book deal, a memoir meets guide on reclaiming one's narrative after betrayal. I helped edit drafts, my accounting precision spotting inconsistencies in her timelines. The book, tentatively titled Beyond the Veil, promised to be a bestseller, and publishers were already buzzing. Meanwhile, my op-ed had sparked interest from a documentary filmmaker, who wanted to feature anonymous stories of understated wealth. I agreed to consult, ensuring the focus stayed on lessons rather than sensationalism. It aired on a streaming service, and viewers reached out, inspired to reassess their own lives. Summer brought expansions to the foundation. We broke ground on a tech education center in Austin, equipped with coding labs for underprivileged kids, funded partly by dividends from my early tech investments. I mentored there weekly, teaching basic finance through games, watching young faces light up as they grasped concepts like saving versus spending. One boy, reminiscent of my younger self, asked about starting small. "Put your $8 in the right place," I told him, echoing my own $8,200 gamble, and watch it grow with time. Emma visited too, leading art workshops that complemented the curriculum, her therapy background shining. As fall returned, a surprise came in the form of a letter from Clay Barlow. He'd completed his community service and written an apology, not the desperate plea of before, but a reflective note acknowledging his flaws. "You taught me more than any court could," it read. I showed it to Emma, who nodded thoughtfully. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," she said. We didn't respond, but it closed a loop, allowing us to move forward unburdened. By year's end, our family had grown, not in numbers yet, but in depth. Emma announced her pregnancy over Christmas dinner, and we celebrated with simple joy. I looked around the table at Alex, his parents, and the life we'd built, knowing that from one act of humiliation had sprung a tapestry of triumphs. Dignity, patience, and quiet strength had prevailed, proving that the truest fortunes are those we share. As the first flurries of a mild Texas winter dusted Round Rock, Emma's pregnancy brought a new layer of anticipation to our home. Morning sickness hit her hard at first, but Alex was there every step, brewing ginger tea and holding her hand through doctor's visits. I converted the spare room into a nursery, painting walls in soft blues and hanging a mobile of paper stars, simple, handmade touches that echoed my mother's resourceful ways. We'd gather in the evenings, discussing names over decaf coffee, settling on Eleanor for a girl, in honor of my mom, or Hayes for a boy, to carry the family legacy forward. It felt poetic, this new life sprouting from the ashes of that disrupted wedding, a testament to how dignity begets deeper joys. My philanthropy efforts surged with renewed energy. The National Teacher Housing Network now spanned 5 states, with the Appalachian site fully operational and buzzing with activity. I traveled more, attending ribbon cuttings incognito, but one trip to Kentucky stood out. There, I met a teacher named Maria, who'd relocated from a crumbling apartment to one of our bungalows. "This stability lets me focus on my students," she said, showing me a classroom where kids were building solar models, inspired by my renewable investments. I shared a quiet lunch with her, swapping stories of modest upbringings, and left with a handmade thank you card from her class. Back home, I funneled more funds into scholarships, ensuring kids like those could access education without the barriers I'd once faced. Emma's book launched to acclaim, hitting bestseller lists and earning her speaking gigs across the country. She wove in anonymized tales from our ordeal, emphasizing resilience over revenge. My father's smile in the face of humiliation taught me everything, she wrote in the dedication. Sales proceeds went partly to the foundation, creating a virtuous cycle. Alex, now promoted at his school, started a financial literacy club for teens, drawing on tips I'd shared. We collaborated on a workshop series, blending my auditing expertise with his teaching skills, empowering young people to spot financial red flags early. Challenges tested us, like when a tabloid dug up the wedding scandal, twisting it into sensational fodder. Reporters camped outside, but we handled it with grace. Emma issued a statement redirecting focus to her advocacy work. It blew over, strengthening our bond. As her belly grew, we took walks in the botanical gardens, the same venue as before, reclaiming the space with laughter instead of tears. The baby arrived in spring, a healthy girl named Eleanor Grace. Holding her in the hospital, I whispered promises of the lessons I'd pass on: wait patiently, act with dignity, and build quietly. Emma smiled wearily, Alex by her side, our family complete. That smeared cake felt like ancient history now, overshadowed by this pure, enduring win.